thank you so much for coming today to be part of our West Virginia for Democracy's Voting Rights Roundtable. We have some excellent speakers lined up, and I'll let them introduce themselves in just a few moments. But again, thank you so much for coming, and I will hand it over to Samuel Hickman, who will be kind of guiding the conversation today.
Thank you so much. My name is Sam Hickman. I'm the Executive Director of the West Virginia chapter of the National Association of Social Workers. I was going to say I'm the outgoing Executive Director, which is not to say that I'm friendly and gregarious, but that I'm actually retiring at the end of this month. So there will be someone new in my place, and I look forward, as you do, to seeing who that will be. I want to welcome all of you here today, particularly our distinguished panel, and for those of you who are watching us, thank you for being here to talk about something that is vitally important. Voting rights are a part of a national conversation, but we're here today in West Virginia to talk about how voting rights affect each and every one of us in the Mountain State. Our voting rights are at risk through legislation being proposed across the country and through inaction in Congress. Even here in West Virginia, a very restrictive voting bill was introduced during the last legislative session that would have limited access to early voting, would have further delayed the implementation of automatic voter registration, and would have removed voters from the voter rolls after missing only one election. This bill actually passed the West Virginia Senate, and it was progressing in the House of Delegates until it was wisely set aside in the Judiciary Committee. Now, because of the proliferation of these types of legislative initiatives, we believe that it is past time for a national standard to ensure that candidates in all states are working on a level playing field, but also, more importantly, that voters in all states can be assured of their right to vote and their access to the polls. Today, we're gathered here in West Virginia with representatives from a number of different organizations. They represent varied constituencies, and they're here to share their thoughts about why voting rights are important to them and the people that they represent, where they see issues within our current system, and to ponder what are the potential paths forward for our democracy. Now, I'm a social worker, and at our best, social workers are all about trying to help people achieve self-sufficiency and self-actualization. In this society, one of the primary ways we can do that is by exercising our right to vote and by encouraging people up and down, all across the broad spectrum of our society to be engaged citizens, informed about who's running and what the issues are, and to exercise their right to vote. Citizenship in social work is a big deal. We try to educate social workers not only to be able to have the skills to do the things they need to do to help people achieve self-sufficiency, but also to model behavior themselves. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves. We have just a couple of minutes per person for that. We will be going on to questions later, so you don't have to feel like you're making every point you hope to make at this event during your introduction. So the speakers will introduce themselves, give brief remarks touching on why voting rights are important to them and their constituencies, and how they relate to the issues that they're working on every day. Let me first recognize the guys here.
Hi, well, I appreciate that. I looked at my tag because I wear many hats, but today I'm here as the organizing director for Young West Virginia. We are a youth and Black-led movement in West Virginia where we develop young leaders into change makers who impact the systems in our everyday lives. So I really won't go too much further right now, and I'll let you pass it.
That's fine. We go on to my right, Leo Ceballos.
Very close, Leo Ceballos.
Close, thank you.
My name is Leo. I'm a 21-year-old college student. Like Takaya, I'm here to represent the youth voters in West Virginia.
Chelsea?
Yeah, my name is Chelsea Horniak. I am the Director of Accounts at 84 Agency. We're a local small business in Charleston, West Virginia. So today I'm representing small businesses, but also in my former life, my former job, I was working with a civic engagement organization, a national organization that was focused in West Virginia on getting high school students out to vote and engage in the civic process. So I can talk a little bit about that.
Thank you so much. Bill Kuhn. I'm sorry, I passed over to John Stokes. I'm sorry, you're right next to me.
Thank you, sir. So hey everyone, my name is Dijon Stokes. I'm the advocacy specialist at the ACLU of West Virginia. I primarily, well, as many of you know, and those that don't know, the ACLU of West Virginia primarily works with civil liberties. And some of those that I work on are voting rights and as well that intersection with the criminal justice system and as well DC statehood. So a lot of what's really pressing for us in these days and these times are making sure voters have that access to the ballot, and that voters, as well, that we're thinking of all voters, those that don't have easily accessible transportation to the polls, those that might not have the best resources to look up who they want to vote for, making sure that they have those resources and that they can as well have access to the ballot in the form of absentee, and then as well that we can look to make sure that it's easily accessible as they go to the DMV, so they have access in that way. And I'll talk a little bit more about that.
There'll be opportunities to talk more about that. Bill Kuhn, please.
Yeah, hi everybody. Bill Kuhn. I'm a Huntington resident. I'm also a veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan. I have studied political management, but I kind of have encountered throughout the years just difficulty voting. I've had challenges where it's just constantly, it comes up even when I'm at the registration table or if I'm getting an absentee ballot. Being a veteran or being an active duty service member, there's usually been hurdles to that. There's also other challenges within our democracy and within our systems or whatever, but happy to be here and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Greg?
My name is Greg Whittington. I'm with the ACLU of West Virginia. I use the he, him pronouns. I'm also with the West Virginia Family of Convicted People. And today I want to speak more on that line. In 1994, I got a letter stating that my rights as a citizen to vote had been revoked. I got out of prison in 2010, and I'm yet to receive a letter saying I can vote. So the West Virginia Family of Convicted People is actively in communities trying to educate folks about their ability to vote if they're incarcerated or prior incarceration, and also making it more accessible for all of West Virginians to vote.
Thank you. Thank you to all of our panelists. Next, we're going to go into a section of open conversation based on some questions. We have 5 questions that we hope will help to illuminate the issues and the problems surrounding voting rights and voter access here in West Virginia. I think I'll start by directing a question to one of the panelists, but other panelists, please feel free to join in. You're welcome to respond. If you're very quiet, I may try to ask you to chime in. And I think we probably have 5 or 6 minutes per question that we can work with. So let me direct the first question, if I may, to Takaya Smith. For democracy to work for all of us, it must include all of us. Can you speak about some of the ways that the groups that you work with and represent have felt shut out of our democracy in recent years?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I primarily work with youth populations and low-income populations. And honestly, there are roadblocks all throughout the electoral process. And what some of those look like for young people who are especially new to the process and are not familiar with it. But both of those populations, youth and low income, are extremely transient, right? So they move around a lot. And so when that happens, there are a couple issues that come with that when you know, you're wanting these communities to be able to have access to system. So often there are these like arbitrary deadlines, right? So if you are young and you're new to this process, like if you could, if you're from Boone County, you might get in at WVU, right? And with a young person, often, you know, sometimes probably not enough. There are, you know, high school voter registration days and things like that. So especially young people who are like 18 in that range, freshmen in college, they got registered at their high schools, and so they are excited and they feel like they did their part by registering, and now they've moved, you know, to their college. And when it comes time to participate, they're like, well, I voted there, but I can just, you know, fill in. I could just vote down the street, right? You know, like right here in my college town. And of course, we know that they can't. But they're new to that process, and when you have those deadlines that are outdated and were created at a time where everything was done by paper, individuals going through paper, it shuts those young people out, and we shouldn't have a system or a process where students are learning by getting shut out. There's really just no reason for that. And I'll say, like, especially with low-income people, we know that poverty makes it hard to be stable. So it's very likely if you're low income, you're going to be moving around a lot and constantly needing to update your registration. And unfortunately, you know, like that doesn't happen enough. And so just those deadlines and same-day registration would be a serious like remedy to those things. So those are just some of the ways that I see the communities we work with being shut out of our democracy.
Thank you. The question is, how do you or the people you work with feel shut out of our democracy in recent years? Greg, you want to try and tackle that?
Sir, really to understand the dynamics of justice impacted people, inability or lack of ability to vote is to understand most of us are just trying to work to meet our basic needs. People are getting out of incarceration after many, many years and or short period of times that their family dynamics never included voting. Their family dynamics often never included employment and upward mobility. So when people are getting out of prison and thinking about picking their lives back up, they don't have the necessary skill sets to just go back and live that normal life. So we have probably 30% of the state's population now that are justice impacted are homeless. We also have the fact that most of us never had a conversation about why voting matters to us, why we should vote. So coupled with the dynamics of voter apathy, lack of knowledge, basic needs, we're a very transient people that you know, often end up back in jails or in recovery communities. That really shapes by and large the dynamics of why we're not voting. So what are we doing as an agency, as an organization to tackle that? Well, the ACLU of West Virginia has a multifaceted approach to tackling that, from our DC statehood to some of the things that Dijon is going to be covering. What I want to cover is what the West Virginia Family of Convicted People has done specifically. We started a voters outreach program. We hired a voting coordinator, and we also wrote a grant that would actually help fund part of what Dijon Stokes is doing so that we are educating our people about voting. We are now going into recovery homes, and we're educating them on voting and how they can vote, how they can register to vote. But we also started a cohort, and this cohort of 15 people is civics leadership, where we are educating 15 people about why it's important to vote, how to vote, how a bill becomes a law, and storytelling, and they are also going into the communities now and registering people to vote. We are working in Wood County, West Virginia, on a campaign around recovery. And there, we hope to register a few thousand people to vote. Last week, I think we registered roughly 180 people to vote. So that's some of the work that we're doing.
Great, thank you. Yeah, the question has to do with feeling shut out of our democracy. Is another panelist would like to speak before we move on to another? Go ahead, please.
Definitely. Similar to the thousands of people who are involved in the criminal justice system who are shut out, just by them not being informed of their rights, just by them, those who are on misdemeanor actually have the right to vote while they're incarcerated, and that was something that we felt is a need here in West Virginia. That's why we went out and we registered people who were in regional jails who had a misdemeanor, and it really doesn't make sense that someone who's in the same facility as them, who has a felony, who has nothing related towards voting, as well cannot vote. So I mean, if they're in the same facility, similar crimes, but a change of degree of crime, not related towards voting, they should have that right. They're being shut out of the system. As well, many working class citizens here in West Virginia. If you look at how Senate Bill 565 in this past session was going to disenfranchise them, it was going to remove one of the Saturdays that especially that last Saturday, that a lot of people look to and have been looking to for the past 20 years. So especially looking at that class of West Virginia citizens, but we also have to look to when you look to them as well. You have to look and see what ways could help them vote better, because our democracy is best when everyone participates. So if we could have instead of the no excuse absentee ballots, so similar to what this pandemic did was it really showed us how everybody really can participate in the absentee process. We can do it effortlessly, and we can do it without any indication of fraud as well. So making sure that everyone has access to the absentee ballot, especially those working class parents, because I mean, you really have to think if someone's working a 9 to 5 or if someone's working double shifts, it's hard for them to make it to those polls, especially if they know if I miss work for today, that's money that I really can't miss out on. They're barely making a bottom bill, so it's like for them to miss that day to go vote, I mean, it's kind of hard, especially, and then you have to think if they have children, it's hard for them to bring the children to the polls as well on those Saturdays. So I mean, again, you have to look at those classes, and 700,000 people are being disenfranchised right now in DC by not having that power of vote in the Senate or the House. Them having a representative in the House to speak on their behalf, but again, that's not enough for 700,000 people, which is bigger than 2 of our U.S. states. So.
I think you got the questions ahead of time, Mr. No, we're going to have time to dig deep into these things, but there are some recurring themes here. I was actually going to start with you for the next question as well, which you've begun to respond to. We're lucky to live in a state where currently we do have 10 days of early voting available to us, but restrictive elections bills are being passed in other states. They're nearly passed in West Virginia, and these would restrict early voting. This could come back in the next session of the West Virginia legislature. Can you speak about an experience that you've had or someone you know in your community around early voting, why it's been good or why having it at risk is bad?
Right. Having early voting is very important because, as we all know, life happens. So I mean, if a family member were to fall sick and you had to leave the state, again, if it's past that absentee request period, then that person is now disenfranchised from being able to vote because life happened. And again, as well, when we look to how the primary people who use early voting, a lot of times they are the elderly, they are the people who are trying to decrease those numbers at the poll because they might be worried about getting sick or having to stand in long lines or things like that. So making sure that we have a diverse method of allowing people to vote eliminates that worry of the poll workers being stressed on the regular voting period days. So I mean, it's really important for us to have that early voting period, which is why I think we fought so hard for it at the legislature. Over 50 people came out to speak on why it was important to them, and they're represented by thousands behind them. So.
Thank you. Others who'd like to speak about early voting? Leo?
Yes. One of my closest friends is a college student who moved to Virginia for her education. And this was back in 2018. It was her first ever election. She did not know that she was able to do early voting. She did not know that she had access to mail-in ballots as a college student who had moved away. And so she thought that the only option available to her was to go on regular election day. So she drove from Virginia to West Virginia, 4.5 hours. She missed a day of school. She missed a shift at work. It was unstable. This was right before the finals period. And it disrupted her education unnecessarily. 2 years later, when it was time for her to vote once again, she now knew that early voting was an option. She was able to do that. She didn't miss any school. She did not miss any work. And she was a very lucky, privileged position to have been able to pull that off the first time. A lot of college students can't miss work. They can't miss days of school. They can't drive. Maybe they don't have cars. So think about all of the people who would not have been able to vote if they were in her position. So it's very important that we don't restrict early voting so that people like her can have access to the ballot.
Thank you. Other panelists, would you like to speak about early
Yeah, I
voting?
have a little story to share about early voting. So when I used to work with high school students, and a lot of times they would organize busing to the polls together to go vote. Mostly for the first time, it was either when they were 17 and they could go vote in the primary election if they were going to be 18 by the general. But there was one situation, it was in Nicholas County, where the students at the neighboring high schools there were organizing students to go bus to the polls during early voting. And one, it was easy to kind of rally kind of a culture and an excitement to go vote early together because they were all going to vote at the same polling place in the county, which I think is nice. And that I logistically, I don't know if this is true, but I feel like it's easier if we extend the time of early voting at those main county hubs. But they were all going to bus to the polls during early voting, and they could do it during school. It was maybe $75 extra on the county to offer up a school bus during those school hours to bus all the students to go early vote. And there was a group of maybe 30 kids, students who were voting for the first time. And one of their teachers, who was in her 50s, she had never voted before. And it was her busing with her students, the excitement, and she got to vote for the first time with her students because they made it so easy to bus to the polls. And it was such a sweet, situation among the students and the teacher having to share that experience together. And it wouldn't have been possible on election day because we don't have school in West Virginia on election day. And so just the opportunity to share that, I think for young people, for small businesses, to have the flexibility to go together to early vote is a really unique time. So I think extending the period of early voting, kind of no harm. Give more options for that other than just 10 days of early voting.
Thank you. Yeah, the examples for getting rid of it seem to have more to do with the convenience of the clerk's office than anything else. Thank you.
If I could add I wanted to just add a little perspective too. Another aspect of why early voting is so needed is also because, unfortunately, we still have a lot of labor issues, and one of those, especially with low-income jobs, is just last-minute scheduling, or they don't let their employees know what their schedule is going to be in a timely fashion, especially with college students, but it's not any more rare with low-income people who are not in college. That's just a low-wage, standard that is really unacceptable, but for many reasons, but one of them is because people can't, it's hard for low-income people to, make a schedule and make a plan for their lives in general, and and that includes voting. So often you'll ask people like, what day can you go vote? Because of course we know as advocates and activists, you know, we want people to make a plan. And often they can't tell you, you know, in the weeks before because, you know, they're like, they don't have the privilege of knowing they work a strict 9 to 5. So just from like an economic perspective, early voting is what's fairest right now until we can address the other stuff.
Thank you for adding that.
If I could answer that. The inability of justice impacted and marginalized people to meet their basic needs often is what is systemic disenfranchisement, in my opinion, because we are out trying to meet our basic needs and trying to live every day. And to elaborate what Takaya and others had said, we don't know often when we call work or our employer if we're going to have work that day. So when you are working every single day just to make your ends meet, voting becomes so far secondary to your lifestyle, to what you know to be true. So having this period of time where we then can work with our justice impacted communities and our marginalized communities to help get them to the poll or help to get them to where they need to be, it's a game changer. We saw this year more people, justice impacted people this year, register to vote and vote more time in the state's history. There's 150,000 formerly convicted people in this state. Less than 3% of them vote. If more of us voted, we wouldn't have some of these antiquated laws and some of these people making laws about us without us. So our campaign slogan this year is nothing about us without us. And that's registering people to vote, getting them to the polls to vote, but giving them the flexibility of a time period that they can actually be there, that works within them. Enfranchising people is giving them ability to change their own lives. Disenfranchising is cutting us off and saying, this is the only time you can vote, this is the only way you can vote. Most of us read at a 7th grade level. So going into a traditional ballot box, looking at it and reading the ballot and understanding what you're actually checking the box for, it's much deeper than just voting. It's understanding what you're voting about. And this period of time gives us an opportunity to work with these people far more than anything I've seen. And also we're veterans. Thank you for your service.
Yeah.
I was a ranger a long, long time ago. And if you're in the military and if you're active duty, you don't know when you're going to be called. And having the ability to work within that schedule, it's got to be paramount for our military people.
Thank you. Bill Kuhn, I wanted to direct this next question first to you, if that's okay. It's very related to our present conversation, but a little nuanced, and this is regarding absentee ballots. We saw through the COVID pandemic that absentee ballots were very important, particularly for certain populations, the elderly, people who work odd schedules or have to be on the road, college students. What are some ways that you can envision having a national standard on absentee voting making a difference in this democracy and making voting more accessible to those who need it?
Yeah. So, I mean, absentee voting, I mean, I've most of my experience voting has been through absentee ballots. I've been a resident of West Virginia, but I've been either abroad or in another, deployed to another location or something along those lines, and I've always relied on an absentee ballot. The thing that being in other places, like what I've seen though, is the use of an absentee ballot allows folks to be informed from their homes, to be able to then vote kind of conveniently from their home. And the pandemic, I mean, it showcased that on a whole different level that I think that we could efficiently roll out ballots, be able to receive them back, get them counted. The question that I often have about whether a national standard on it is like how that ends up differing between states, and how each state or even territories in certain circumstances, how they're able to make sure that that is unified from national policy. There's no question to me that there's a benefit of an absentee ballot. I think that, you know, I voted absentee in the primary last election, and then voted in person for the general. And this goes in hand with early voting, but I listened to my family, you know, all of us like constantly like kind of checking in with one another to be able to know, did you mail it? Have you done it yet? What questions do you have? And so I found that the network, that not just only just the availability of the absentee ballot, but also that like it reinforced engagement with, at least within my family, my network, about whether or not we're engaging in the process. I don't know if that exactly like answers the question, but hopefully like in the ballpark there. So.
Great, thank you. Yeah, the question is absentee voting making democracy more accessible. Other panelists, I think I cut you off earlier.
Honestly, absentee voting is very paramount, and I think as far as looking at a national standard for what absentee voting can look like, we can look at states that are already doing it and have been doing it for the past 20 years. So I mean, when you look at states like Oregon, who have an absentee voting model, and they don't have. And I think there's many times a misnomer about, well, there'll be more indication of fraud. And actually, in our history, there's been less than a 1% indication of fraud in the process. So I mean, it's not that we can't do it. We don't have the accesses and resources to do it. It actually would make it easier on our county clerks. There would be less people at the polls because, as we've seen in this COVID-19 era, a lot of people will use the absentee ballot if they have the opportunity. And it actually gives people more time to sit back and say, I want to research this candidate. I want to look into who I want to vote for. And it helps college students already using that method. So I mean, honestly, that's some of our youngest population showing us that we can and are able to use that process. Especially some of the population that used it some of the most is our elderly. Those 50 and over and 65 and older made up a large part of the demographic who use absentee voting. So catering to them and making sure they don't have to worry about how I'm going to get to the polls, are they going to be wheelchair accessible? Because some but not all are wheelchair accessible. So making sure that we use those methods to make sure that everyone feels comfortable using that process. So.
Thank you. Other thoughts about the absentee voting making democracy more accessible?
Yeah, thank you for mentioning college students, because college students are far more likely to be moving, changing places frequently, far more likely to be working minimum wage jobs, very little flexibility, also far more likely to not have any experience with voting. It makes it easier. You can Google things from the comfort of your home, learn things about the candidates. It's essential that absentee voting be made as accessible and simple as possible, because there's no alternative for many college students. One way to do that would be, excuse absentee voting. In the state of West Virginia, there are certain conditions that you have to meet in order to qualify to get a mail-in ballot, such as incarceration and military service. But these restrictions are really meaningless. We don't need them, and I know people who have been denied the right to vote for simple clerical errors around that this restriction. It's also essential that ballots are sent out in a timely fashion. We can't have ballots arriving late, and then people, not sending it by the certain postmark deadline, not receiving it. That's essential for college students who live out of state, out of the country, essential for military personnel who are living in other countries. And we also need a sufficient number of drop boxes weeks before the election to ensure that once you return the mail, there are safe, secure places to drop them off, such as rural areas, areas accessible by public transportation, and on college campuses.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to the next question if I could, and this one I want to start with Leo Ceballos, if I might. As a country and as a state, we're seeing an historic wealth gap that continues to grow. At the same time, more and more partisan money is influencing our elections. What sentiments have you seen or heard in the communities and organizations that you're involved in around how this influence affects their ability to have a voice in our nation's future?
Well, there's a reason we have the broke college student stereotype. We barely have the money to buy ramen, let alone donate to political campaigns. Even the few who donate a few dollars here and there are not giving on the scale of mega donors. This leads to candidates who do not court young people for their contributions. They do not care about our opinions as much. And candidates very rarely speak to us as a group, even though we are one of the largest potential voting blocs. Nor do they have organizing systems that engage us. Our voting rights are not prioritized, and that shows every election season when our voter turnout numbers for youth come in. The only way that we're going to create a system where politicians in Washington have a mandate to actually serve the people, including the young constituents, is if we change the incentive systems in elections and make the chances of winning more correlated with the community outreach and actually delivering on promises made to constituents rather than just with fundraising. For a young generation who have some of the lowest rates of wealth in the nation, it's very important for us to have our voices heard anyway.
Thank you for that. Thanks so much. Other thoughts about money in politics? Okay. Chelsea?
Oh, Ty? You guys I was going to just pass this one to you all.
Okay. How about this side?
I would just add that I think similar to what was said earlier. I think we have to look at who has access at the Capitol, because honestly, I'm a lobbyist, but I think everyone and all citizens should have access at the Capitol. It shouldn't be that we have fees to be registered as a lobbyist. We shouldn't have where you have to pay different forms that could be scary to a lot of everyday West Virginians, because if you register as a lobbyist, if you don't have experience, if you don't have someone that you can go to, luckily at the ACSW we have people that we can kind of go to and mentor with that can help you fill out some of those forms, because honestly, like after you come back from your first session and you have to fill out the forms, whether there were any donations, whether there were any say if you were to go out to dinner or to buy someone I guess a donut or a coffee or something like that. A lot of those information, there aren't really tutorials on how to fill out those type of forms. You have to reach out and get that information. So making sure that information is accessible, and also letting people know that they can go meet with their legislators, they can go set up that meeting, they can have a conversation with them, because when we're in a nature that where it feels like if you don't have money, you don't have access, a lot of people are afraid to even get involved in the system because they think their legislators and their senators and delegates are too high above them for them even to speak to. So I think it's definitely paramount for sure. For us to make. Oh, sorry. I was just saying it's definitely paramount for us to make sure that all people have access to, regardless of how much money they have or how much they're donated toward the campaign.
Other thoughts on this question?
Go for it.
We've embraced it. We realize there is money in this. So we are working with other organizations that are writing grants so that we can hire justice-impacted people to get them trained on civic activities so that they become community leaders. And we are also embracing the fact that we have to get out to vote and we have to get involved. Again, we go back to 150,000 formerly convicted people in the state that are not voting. They're making laws and policies about us without us. So for us to have equal access to some of the wealth that is being created in this state, we also have to have access to the abilities to get new jobs, to be involved in this infrastructure bill that's happening, and so that justice-impacted people, marginalized people, minimized people not only have a voice in the matter, but they're also learning the process by which they can get grants to get people working. or they can have access to employment opportunities, that some of the federal legislation that is coming down is going to impact us. There is tens of millions of dollars getting ready to come to West Virginia in infrastructure bills that we need access to. We need new entrepreneurs. We need people that live in the state, owning the resources and controlling these resources, so thereby we can hold people accountable. When elected officials make these promises, we hold them accountable for those things. We also have to get involved. We have to run for office, and we have to hold positions ourselves and be tax-paying entrepreneurs.
Thank you. Thank you for reminding us of that. Before I move on to the final question, which we're going to start with Chelsea Hornak on that, so I'll give you a minute to sweat. I want to mention that representatives of both of our United States Senators' offices, the senators themselves, were invited to be here today or to send members of their staff. They did not choose to participate today. We do have a letter, a sign-on letter for the members of this panel and I to send to them the message that we hope they will spend some time with the recording of this event to learn about what's at stake for voting rights in West Virginia and how West Virginians feel about what they should be doing in Washington to protect our rights. So the final question, Chelsea Hornak, is we see in the news every day that there is a sharp partisan divide. But here in West Virginia, we can find some examples of how we put aside political differences. We've elected members of different parties to fill our 2 U.S. Senate seats, for example. Can you share with us any stories or ways you can think of that we can work together better across the partisan lines to move past the gridlock in our political system?
Yeah, so I know West Virginia, we get a really bad rap with, low voter turnout, low voter registration, and all those things. But one thing that we always rank really, really high on is the personal relationships. I think, nationally, we're one of the top states where, we talk to our neighbors. We eat dinner around the table together with different groups of people, and we're congregating together. We're very community-driven. And I think harnessing that and, focusing on that, we do that every day, all the time, in our political system among communities on the ground. I think the hard part is, working that up into the systems, of course. But the ability is there in our communities. And I don't know, just personally, from what I've seen, I am fortunate enough to work in a small business where we are all supportive of one another and open to each other. And so I know I am very fortunate to have that, especially as a young person in West Virginia. I have a job and work on a good team. But not everyone has that in their work environment or work in their families. And so making sure that we're all talking, I think, and building each other up and just talking about in terms of informing each other and how to be informed in the voting process is really important, and lifting that up rather than focusing on left and right. And it's not all black and white. And so just being able to come to the table and talk about it, and as a community, I think is really important.
Thank you for reminding us of that. The quality of the personal relationships in West Virginia. When people come here from other states, the word I often hear them speak most is authentic.
Mm-hmm.
That people are really their true selves. Mm-hmm. Other thoughts about the partisan divide in our communities and nation, ways we can overcome?
So this has always been a challenging issue, I think, for myself, where I've worked on a political campaign in the state before, and I've not found it to be that there is, so we want voting to happen, we also want peaceful transition of power to happen. One of the things that was very disturbing for me last year was that as a veteran, I witnessed in Huntington multiple times armed convoy, going through my town, intimidating me, trying to intimidate me. And there's a dialogue that happens online where like there's not a dialogue. There's a screaming match that happens, and there's a disconnection between our authentic selves and the political message that's being pushed to us. And I wish that I had a solid solution for it. It runs deeper than I think than just the ad campaigns that are presented to us. But the thing that it always comes back to is our duty as citizens, I think, of this country, to vote and to encourage people to vote, and to not block, not to create bills, not to jeopardize that and to limit it, but to rather embrace it, and for it to not be something that is necessarily a competition between multiple parties or individuals, but that we can celebrate that this thing is happening here. I've been participated in providing security for elections in Iraq and Afghanistan, and to see those people take the risk that they do to vote and to come out of there with proof that they voted. I want to see. I just worry about the future. I hope that that folks are taking a little bit more pause when they're submitting these bills in place, and hopefully we can just embrace it a little bit more. Just embrace like folks running, folks voting, instead of like trying to block that from happening either through money or through coercive legislation attempts. But sorry, there's a little bit of a rant, maybe, I don't know, but yeah.
Thank you, and thank you for helping others understand the value of democracy.
I can think of, in West Virginia, we have many elected people that are citizens that are not full-time politicians. We have a handful of people that are full-time politicians. But we had a House bill, was 2257, that would have increased 10 years to a person that had been convicted of substance abuse with trafficking, and it was going to be retroactive, and it would have been very harmful to most of the people that I work with and I represent. I'm also a paid lobbyist, but I can tell you this particular House Bill 2257, we mobilized the West Virginia family convicted people, the recovery community. We geo-fenced around the Capitol. But primarily, we met with the people that had sponsored that bill, and we started talking about why this bill was bad. And we were able to work together in a bipartisan fashion to end this bill and to move forward and look at some of the systemic problems we have with the opioid problems. And West Virginia, while we may have many of our problems with Republican and Democrat, most of the time, if you look, it's just how we're going to perform that. We want the same thing. It's just how we're going to getting there. We also have a situation in Parkersburg at the moment where the city council has put a moratorium on sober living houses. I spoke at that. The ACLU of West Virginia is actively considering filing legal briefs against this. And not getting into all the legal merits of why this will fail, fair housing, ADA, the 14th Amendment. We have a unique opportunity, and we're doing it. We are working with Republicans and Democrats in Wood County. We're starting to put together a coalition of people to work to solve this problem, because it is a problem. Homelessness and the opioid externalities that comes with that has led to many people in Wood County being homeless, and the treatment process is not working. So by us creating a coalition of working people together to solve problems on a local level, we can do it on a state level. But it seems in DC, we don't have the same situation. We're constricted by gridlock that's too often geared towards special interest or the money of where this money's going to. They're not doing the people's work. The infrastructure bills and the bills that we as United States have needed forever has languished on somebody's desk or some committee for far too long. And it's time that DC starts becoming accountable. And maybe that, and hopefully that is by us holding our elected people accountable. If they choose not to be here, to send people here to be here with us and to talk to us, then we need to educate our constituents and say, maybe our senators need to get in touch with us. There's 150,000 formerly convicted people in the state that don't vote. How many people do you guys represent that do vote? So eventually, as we're holding these people accountable, they'll come back to West Virginia and they'll wonder, or they'll ask, what is it you can do to help us? Because we put them there. They are our representatives.
If I can add to that, I think it's very paramount. So when as Greg talks about us being a lobbyist, when you go in and you talk, and the first thing they look at is what organization you're representing. And instead of that, you should look at first, like they should instead be looking, is this a West Virginia? So for a local politician, is this a West Virginia resident? Who are they coming? Like, are they coming here to talk to me? What issue are they coming here to talk to me about? Because a lot of times I think we've lost, because I've been involved with going to the Capitol since about 2017. So you saw that shift as administrations have changed of, okay, we can talk about any issue you all have. We may disagree about it, but at the end of the day, we can talk about it and we can come to some conclusion at the end of the day. Because you're coming to them presenting facts and presenting expertise around an issue that they might not really know all the way about because, again, they have so many bills to worry about and they might not have that time to research those type of bills. But again, like eliminating what organization someone's with, eliminating what party someone's with. We should really be talking about what issue are we talking about, how's it going to serve the constituents that you represent, and get into the nitty-gritty of the actual policy instead of looking at what organization or what party you are. So.
Thank you. Well, that's a very good point. We have a citizen legislature. They cannot be experts on every issue, and they need us, who know something about the issues that are coming before them, to share our expertise with them. Or else they're going to make a vote one way or another. Other thoughts, last thoughts on the partisan divide? Yes,
If I could add, I work for an organization called Unpack, which is young voters across the nation who are trying to get the dark money out of politics and political corruption. As part of that work, I go door to door as a canvasser supporting the For the People Act, and I talk to hundreds of West Virginians on every side of the political spectrum, and I see a lot of overlap in their concerns and their priorities. People don't feel like their voices are being heard. People are worried about the opioid epidemic. They're worried about their jobs getting shipped overseas. They're worried about young people leaving the state. They can't pay their bills. They're struggling with disability benefits. And a lot of that frustration gets taken out on the other side. But then I'll go next door, and the person on the other side has the exact same concerns. So it's really not about who's right and who's wrong in this, political partisan debate. It's about the working class people coming together against the ultra-wealthy elites who do not represent our best interests and the best interests of the vast majority of the people in our state. And I think that passing the For the People Act is truly the best first step that we can take towards starting to close these deep partisan divides, because we all want to work together to heal our country, and because we all want the same things. We all want a better life for ourselves, for our community, for our family, and the way to do that is by creating a government that works for the working people, not just the elites.
Thank you. Other final thoughts? If not, I want to thank all of our panelists for being here. I want to encourage again Senator Capito and Senator Manchin and their staff members to take a good hard look at this recording. As a group, we ask our 2 U.S. senators to seriously consider what's been spoken here today when they deliberate and strive to build a federal election standard that ensures that as many West Virginians as possible are able to cast their votes in every future election as easily as possible. Thank you all for being here today, and thank you to our panelists.